Great to be back with you. I am Rashad Robinson, the president of Color of Change. Color of Change is a next generation civil rights organization with over 7 million members around the country. And we work to make government, corporations, media more responsive to Black folks. We run campaigns, we work on the inside and the outside, and every single day we're working to channel presence into power. The visibility and the awareness, the sort of representation, the shout outs from the stage that Black people get into the power to actually change the rules. With a deep understanding that when we mistake presence for power, we think that something has happened that hasn't. We think that a Black president means that we have gotten post-racial. We will think that sometimes that America celebrating and loving Black celebrities means that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture, and America can hate Black people and love Black culture at the same time and celebrate it and monetize it, and doesn't have to conflict. And so what we're constantly trying to do as a 21st century civil rights organization is work to change the rules, work to continue to push the needle. And we've appreciated over the years our ability to work with ADCOLOR. From almost the very beginning, back when I was at GLAAD, I worked with ADCOLOR in all sorts of ways and have appreciated not just Tiffany's leadership, but the entire team behind ADCOLOR and the work that they are doing to ensure that our visibility, that our voice, that our talent, that our creativity is included in the stories and the narratives that are put out into the world and that shape the stories that are told. I am incredibly excited about what's about to happen. We are about to have a real treat and get to hear from one of our generation's, this generation's most inspiring, creative, and brilliant leaders. Alicia Garza is one of my best friends, but Alicia Garza is also one of my favorite leaders. Alicia brings such a tremendous amount of experience at the grassroots level, working to build and power campaigns in the Bay Area, then taking her efforts national as one of the co-creators, along with Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi, of the Black Lives Matter Global Network. After the verdict in the George Zimmerman case, Alicia not just posted a love letter to Black Americans saying that Black Lives Matter, but in the process worked to build the infrastructure, a network of organizations around the country, local chapters that could work to channel that presence and visibility into the power to change the rules. Alicia has now moved on to found and build a new organization called the Black Futures Lab, creating one of the largest surveys ever, the largest survey ever done of Black people in this country, and really being able to then take that and build it into a policy platform, a 21st century policy platform around economic justice, criminal justice, jobs, and so much more. Alicia is a true pioneer and this year's Beacon Award winner. I am so incredibly honored now to welcome Alicia Garza to the ADCOLOR stage. Hey, sister.
Oh, good morning, my love. That was an amazing introduction. What a way to start my day. And hello to everybody.
You're out in the Bay Area, so it's early.
It's very early and quite apocalyptic. But hello to everybody at ADCOLOR, and thanks so much for having us.
Mm-hmm. And when I say Alicia is one of my closest friends, when I mean that, the room that I'm sitting in right now is her room in my apartment. That's her pull-out couch back there. And so I actually want to jump right in because we are sort of in this conversation around representation and images. We are in a moment where more and more people are asking what they can do, how they can sort of be a force multiplier towards real systemic and long-lasting change. And you actually have a new book coming out October 10th, right?
October 20th.
October 20th. So there's all sorts of ways that you can pre-order that book. And I'll give you some more prompts around that before we close out. But Alicia's book, The Purpose of Power, really takes us on a journey, both of her life, but also sort of her philosophy around organizing, around culture change. One of the things that I want to start off with is really, you talk about sort of growing up in the 80s and in the 90s and MTV, and the role that sort of cultural images and cultural storytelling sort of had in terms of sort of shaping your reality. And for so many of the folks in the audience who are the modern storytellers, who are telling the stories and shaping the images that the next Alicia Garzas will get, I'm interested in sort of if you can share a little bit about sort of how that shaped you, a little bit about sort of how you talk about it in the book, and sort of the power and importance of stories as it relates and connects to movement and movement builders.
Totally. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Rashad, for talking about my book. For anybody who's ever written a book, I should just tell you, it's harrowing work. So the book is called The Purpose of Power: How We Come Together When We Fall Apart. And I was really inspired to write this book after about 3 years of being in the center of a completely wild, turbulent moment in this country, where we were having yet another reckoning around race. Certainly 7 years later, here we are again, and there's lots to compare and contrast to the early parts of Black Lives Matter. But I'm glad that you brought up MTV and the way that it shaped me in a larger conversation about culture and how culture has the power, right, to shape our political landscape. I am an 80s baby. And I'm like, don't let the baby face fool you. I am an 80s baby. And the earliest memories that I have of being politicized actually happened with MTV. This was a moment in this country where MTV was putting out news you could use, as Rashad would say, and using the power of music actually to also draw people in to learn more about what was happening, not just in this country, but around the world. It was through MTV that I learned about the AIDS crisis. It was through MTV that I learned about the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was through MTV that I learned about the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And that shaped me indelibly as a young person who was becoming politically aware. So often we think that people who are a part of movements are just kind of born that way. And we're told those stories all the time. We're told that people like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks literally came out of the womb ready to fight. And I guess that could be true. But what is also true is that our environment shapes us very much. And for me, as a young person, a young Black person, growing up, for the first part of my life in a predominantly low-income Black and Brown community, and for the second part of my life in a predominantly white and wealthy community, it was important that my ideas about the world around me were being shaped. Now, of course, we could have a whole conversation about the role that corporations play in that, right? And whether or not that shaping is neutral. And Rashad, you and I talk about this all the time, especially as it relates to social media platforms like Facebook. But I think the purpose of this story here is that, one of the ways that power operates in our society is by shaping ideas, by winning hearts and minds in order to change behaviors. You all know that very much. That is central to the work that you all do. But I want to be clear that actually, part of the role of culture in movements is incredibly, incredibly strong. I would say that the beginning of Black Lives Matter really did a lot to build cultural power. It did a lot to shape and reshape the stories about Black people, particularly in America, but around the world, when our stories had been being shaped for us for so long. If you were to leave it up to people who are not Black, who would tell you about Black folks in this country, as you said earlier, we might think that we were in a post-racial society. But for me, growing up, also with the influences of, television and MTV in particular, I was very clear from a young age that we were not in a post-racial society. That wasn't just about what I was seeing on television. It was also very much about how I was experiencing life. But when you bring those things together, there's incredible power in being able to shape and tell your own stories. When I talk about the purpose of power, I'm really trying to get to an understanding that, the things that are wrong in this country right now are not necessarily just a function of people being mean to each other. It's a lot of what we see in the news and on television. The way that we interpret what we see in our communities is that we say, oh, well, people are just being mean to each other. And if people would be nicer to each other, then the world would be better and it would be more fair and more equitable. But the fact of the matter is stories, right, help to actually shape the rules that organize our lives. And Rashad, you and I talk a lot about power, and we talk about how power is the ability to change the rules. The work that I do, either that I've done with Black Lives Matter, the work that I do with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and the work that I do with the Black Futures Lab is all about changing the rules that have been rigged against our communities for generations and making sure that the people who are creating the new rules, right, are the ones who have been closest to the pain of the rigged rules. So in closing, I will just say that this conversation about culture, right? And the ways in which culture shapes our behaviors is incredibly important in reimagining what our present and what our futures can look like.
So that's such a great way to start, right? To think about sort of our present and our realities, to think about, what does it mean for stories to impact our lived experiences, and what does it mean for stories to in some ways represent our lived experiences? We're talking to brand builders, right? People who build and engage with and advance some of the most powerful, iconic brands in the world, and some of the brands that maybe aren't as iconic around the world, but are iconic inside of subcultures of communities that make people feel and act and engage, that inspire us. Black Lives Matter as a global brand, right, is now on streets. It's on flags above capitals. It has been a journey, right? These last seven-ish years, right? Last 7 years, it has been a journey from it being something that was racist to even say out loud, to now something that it is embraced in a mainstream way. How do you sort of think about that? How do you think about what lives inside of the brand, lives inside of those words to give it the type of meaning? How do you work to hold on to it so that even while it travels and can mean a lot of things, it doesn't lose the intention and the power behind it?
Sure. I think it's an ongoing process, to be honest. And your question is really important because I think it's one that people are grappling with all over the world. I was really struck by the conversation that preceded us, right? Where, we kind of talk about how we encourage other people to show up in the abstract. But then when there is a moment for us to show up differently, how we often don't really have a compass for that, or how that's often sometimes even been made invisible for us. What does it mean to tell people to show up as their full selves and yet show up in our workplaces knowing that we have a pattern and practice of adaptation to a set of structures and rules and culture that actually is not built for us? That hit me like right in my gut as I was watching that previous conversation and sipping on my coffee and trying to get ready for this one. Oftentimes when people ask about the Black Lives Matter name, some people do talk about it as a brand. And I would say that it has actually evolved into a brand. As somebody who helped to create this, right, I can tell you that people ask me all the time, how do I make a brand out of the thing that is important to me? And the way that people phrase it to me often is, well, how do I turn a hashtag into a movement? And I'd say to people, you cannot turn a hashtag into a movement. Hashtags are hashtags, but movements are comprised of people. And movements are comprised of, and they require, in order to be successful, a relationship between culture change and policy change. We have to change the way we be together, and we have to change the way that we're organized. And those things have to have a symbiotic relationship. I will be honest too. Lots of people think that, that Black Lives Matter, similar to maybe Occupy Wall Street, right, had a whole strategy behind it. And I'm here to tell you, it really did not. And you might be like, that's not possible. I'm sure y'all were sitting in some conference room somewhere, with whiteboards and graphs and brainstorms and all these things. That's actually not how this happened. This phrase, right, was really born out of grief and rage and vision for possibility for our futures. And we spent a full year just testing different ideas that we had, not around how to make Black Lives Matter a brand. That was never actually in our consciousness. It was all about how is it that we bring people together online who we are seeing are, rageful and full of grief and full of pain, people who are going through a reckoning in real time. I was going through a reckoning in real time, and I'm somebody who's been doing this work for 20 plus years. And I even thought that when Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman, and George Zimmerman went on trial for his murder, I was quite sure that the result of that trial was going to be that George Zimmerman was going to be held accountable, even though I know how deeply unequal and unfair these systems are. And so I can't emphasize enough, right, that there are some points of change in our lives that are fairly scripted. And there are other parts of change in our lives that are not. They're deeply organic. And then there are people who step into the space to help test and innovate and experiment with how can we use something that we're finding is really resonating with people? How do we use it towards the ends of organizing, bringing people together to understand what the problems are that we are facing and why we're facing those problems, and then frankly coming up with plans and solutions together on how we want to address that. That's all that organizing is. And so, I offer this because, again, I think, for the good folks at ADCOLOR, I know that you all spend your days really trying to think about how to use brands in order to do good. And I think that for us, we didn't think about it from the purpose and from the perspective of branding. We thought about it from the purpose and perspective of connection. And I know that there's overlap there, but there's also some separation and distance. I also think that it's important to recognize that for Patrisse and Opal and myself, I think we witnessed in real time an organizing project that we were trying to build turn into a brand and turn into a symbol that we had to struggle over the substance of. For the first year of this project, Patrisse and Opal and I never actually talked about the fact that this was something that we were building. We didn't talk about that publicly. We just were building it. Opal was creating online platforms for people to be able to come together online to do something together offline. Patrisse and myself, right, and Opal too, were actually organizing in our own communities around Black Lives Mattering, being able to use this phrase to connect the various issues that Black people are dealing with every single day of our lives and to not have them be separate silos. So, if you were an alien who dropped from outer space into the United States during an election season, for example, you would think that the only thing that Black people care about is criminal reform, right? And maybe marijuana reform as it relates to criminal reform. But the fact of the matter is, that is a function of our experiences and our our lives, being regurgitated back to us, but not shaped by us. And so I think it's interesting that Patrisse and Opal and I got to actually see the process of this thing that we were building turn into a brand that had very little content. And it was only when we started to see that people were doing the all lives matter, Black, brown, and green lives matter. We saw things like dog lives matter. And then, of course, we started to see things like blue lives matter. And even with people saying Black lives matter, they were only placing Black cisgender heterosexual men at the center of that conversation. And for Patrisse and Opal and myself, who, are daughters of immigrants and, Black queer women. And Opal is not actually queer. And I feel like I have to say that because she has said that we've impacted her dating life indelibly. So
I talked to her about that over tea. Yeah.
Incredibly in solidarity, but she's like, yo, I'm actually not queer. So anyways, I say all this to say, Rashad, that, we had to step in to keep adding substance to what was quickly becoming a symbol. And I think that we're still deep in that struggle today. And the things that I think are helpful in that struggle is making sure that we're organizing our communities, making sure that we're amplifying and lifting up even people inside of our communities who get marginalized when we talk about civil rights, when we talk about human rights, when we talk about what it means for people to live well. We still have too much of a pattern of leaving some of our folks behind. Last thing I want to say about this piece is, it's interesting because right now in this moment, Black Lives Matter is polarized in a different way than it was in 2013. And in some ways, we're being polarized also inside of Black communities. There is this tension, right, about what it means for Black lives to matter. There's a backlash, right, from, I think, a politic that really says, Black communities and Black families are one way. And anybody who dares to challenge that, right, is challenging the sanctity of who Black people are. And I want to be super clear that the way that we know, right, that this phrase and this movement has power, right, is that it's making people uncomfortable. At the same time, I think the thing that we have to always be mindful of, right, is that, there are things that we need to be doing in our everyday lives to make sure that this symbol continues to have substance and that this symbol isn't able to be used in ways that, promise the world but deliver absolutely nothing. And so what is it?
I want to jump in there. I want to talk about that right there. Because we're talking to a lot of folks that work inside of big corporations or who do media buys, right? And can make a choice between whether or not they buy with a Black publication or they try to reach Black people through a non-Black publication. There are all sorts of choices every single day. But across the space, there has been a lot of signaling that Black Lives Matter, right? And this idea that you're speaking to around making sure that it means something, At Color of Change, we've launched something called Beyond the Statement to really try to get companies to commit to transparency around data, to real policy change, to help sort of put some energy behind it. But the challenge with a brand, right, is that it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people, and that we have to figure out how to place that. And so as companies, as people inside of businesses reach out to you and inquire about what they can do to really meet the sort of statement, the caring with the action, meet the aspiration with results. What are the things that you tell people? What are the things that you tell people who are senior leaders inside of a company, regardless of race? What do you tell Black people and allies inside of companies who may not be at the senior level, who might be organizing inside of employee resource groups or other places? What are you telling them about the things that can be force multipliers for change?
Well, first of all, Thank you for focusing me. I was just about to actually say that one example of not matching symbol with substance is Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick, as you all know, literally lost his career because he took a stand in support of Black Lives Matter. He took a stand against police violence and police brutality, and he did so by taking a knee. He was called, a bastard by this president, and he was ultimately excluded, right, from being able to be picked up by another team, and he was incredibly demonized. This year, right, the head of the NFL, the same one, right, who allowed for this to happen, did a public apology. He got on a Zoom like we're doing right now and said, we are sorry and we support Black Lives Matter. And today, Colin Kaepernick still doesn't have a job. Right. So I think it's important to just kind of put that kind of example in front of us to say that it's actually not super complicated what people can do. But what it requires is a level of courage and political will. I get asked a lot by companies and people inside companies what they can do to match the energy that is happening in the streets or in their communities. And I often say, look around you. How many Black people are in your C-suite? And how many of those Black people are there because you value their strategy and their vision? Some people are going to get mad because I'm going to say this, but I'm going to say this. We've seen a really interesting trend over the last couple of years where, sure, we might be able to say there are Black people in a C-suite, but the positions that we often hold are those of diversity consultants, right? That has become kind of a new trend across corporate America that, we don't want to get slammed for not having Black representation. And so we're going to make sure that we have a position often filled by a Black person, often filled by a Black woman that's going to look at diversity and inclusion in our company. And we're going to have a lot of great conversations about diversity. We're going to make sure that we do things like celebrate Black History Month. And, maybe we'll even do, a video chat about Fannie Lou Hamer. But at the end of the day, representation is not everything and it's not enough. That is a clear example of how we have symbol without substance. What we need to be doing is making sure that our companies are led by the vision and strategy of Black people who, frankly, are bringing the experience of what it means for Black people to be excluded, right? Not just from the staffing of a company, but from the vision and the strategy. And we need to make sure that that space is wide open. We need to also ensure that we are paying Black people equitably in relationship to their peers inside of a company. We need to also make sure that it's not Black people's responsibility to teach and educate companies about racism. I mean, there are very kind of basic things that we can do, but it requires us to have the courage and the political will to say, we're going to figure this out. I want to give another quick example, Rashad, because I often get asked to come to companies and talk about Black Lives Matter and talk about how they can be more inclusive. And I'll be honest, I often say no. And the reason that I say no is because I'm not a diversity consultant. What I am is an organizer. I'm somebody who knows how to bring people together who are affected by a problem, to learn about the roots of that problem and to make plans to find solutions to that problem by working together and fighting back. That's what I do. I don't spend a lot of time explaining to people what white supremacy is. I don't spend time talking to people about inclusion because I don't think inclusion or diversity is the problem. The problem is that power is not equally distributed in this society across a range of platforms. And so from corporate America to City Hall to Congress, power is not distributed equally. And if we're not addressing that problem, we're not actually changing the dynamics that we claim to decry. So let me just give another quick example because I want to make sure we hit home on this. I was contacted by somebody recently, because there has been a flurry in the last couple of months about wanting to make sure that people are giving to Black Lives Matter and that they're saying Black Lives Matter. And they want us to know in particular that they're doing that. And on one side of my heart, I'm like, I'm warmed and energized by it. I'm like, this is important that this movement is touching so many corners of our society. But on the other hand, it can become cosplay in some way, right? Where we are acting justice, but we're not living justice. And so, I had an experience with a company that wanted to give me money and to give my organization money, even though they were currently involved and engaged in deeply problematic behaviors as it related to Black power and Black people. They, in fact, are a company that certainly is not a good actor in the space, right? And willingly, right, and eagerly often takes the kind of resources, right, and attention away from Black organizations that are doing important work, and they center themselves in spaces that they don't belong in. And so the idea behind, rushing to give us money was to be able to say, no, see, we know Black people. I've got a Black friend. And the impact of that is incredibly corrosive. And so, I just want to close by saying, it's actually not rocket science. We can look around us in our organizations and we can see all of the ways in which racism is shaping our immediate environment. And we can do something about that is not just symbol. We can actually say, from this point forward, we are going to make sure that the experiences of Black people who have been left out and left behind are at the center of the work that we do. And sometimes in order to get to that place, there has to be a reckoning inside of an institution, whether it be a grassroots organization or a multi-billion-dollar company, about what it would mean to do that. What would it mean to shift? And who would be displaced, right? And what would be the impact of that? And I think those are uncomfortable conversations that we need to have in order for that reckoning to start to become complete.
And I think what, part of what you were bringing us, and it's always funny to hear stories you tell that I know the background, but, yeah. So, you were talking about structural change. You were talking about what does it mean to get to structural change? And sometimes we say structural change, right? 70% of Americans now plus believe that Black people face systemic racism, right? And when we talk about these issues, I don't always know if people, once again, have the language or the stories to fill in the words, right? And fill in the sort of space around systemic racism or structural change. What is the difference between that and charity? What is the difference between making sure that people's pipes are clean in Flint because corporations are paying their fair share, not just that we sent water bottles because people don't have clean water? What does it mean when public education is fully funded in our country, not just that we do those inner city service days that make us feel good because those kids are so good and so bright and talented, and we know they're just going to be something one day. But what does it mean that we actually have the systems and structures? We say it in our language. We'll say Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank instead of banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. We will say Black women are less likely to get C-suite positions in advertising instead of advertising doesn't hire Black women for C-suite positions. On one hand, you try to fix Black women, a whole lot of pipeline programs that don't always end up changing the structures that people end up in, or financial literacy programs so people can do better inside of banks that have excluded them. So part of what we as a movement, right, as a larger movement for Black lives, have been pushing for is not just charitable solutions, but actual structural change. Not seeing inequality as unfortunate like a car accident, but actually translating that into the real change. And so as you sort of have really seen this moment, right, this sort of moment where the polling numbers have changed, and even if there's been some retrenchment, a huge shift over the last several years, what have been some of the things that have been most surprising as you've had to sort of put the language and the focus on actually getting us to change, not just to charity?
I think the thing that is most surprising, or maybe the most enduring, is our deep misunderstanding about how racism works. Again, I talked about how so often we look at these kinds of issues as interpersonal problems that can be solved by people being nicer to each other, that can be solved through charitable acts, trash pickups at the sides of highways, food giveaways at homeless camps. But we often, shy away from talking about, well, what would it mean for us to not build so much market rate housing and make sure that we are building affordable housing at all levels of income that people can access? You know, these kinds of challenges are endemic and enduring. And I want to just say very quickly that, part of the challenge of understanding racism as an interpersonal problem, as people being mean to each other, is that then the solutions are individualized, and it's dependent on each individual person to step up to a set of values. When the fact of the matter is, values are important, but also rules are important. And rules are what shape our everyday lives. When you're driving, you stop at a stop sign. That is a rule that then has a consequence if you break it. And you can be a really nice person and run a stop sign. But if you run a stop sign, you are going to get a ticket. That is an example of how rules function. Rules are, in a lot of ways, supposed to be the great equalizer. And racism is about rules, right, that consolidate power in the hands of a few at the expense of many on the basis of phenotype and skin color. And if it's not phenotype and skin color, then it's gender. And if it's not gender, then it's sexuality. And if it's not sexuality, then it's disability. And if it's not disability, it's citizenship. And the point of this is to say this: there are rules that are categorizing people based on things that are quite superficial, but they are always for the purpose of apportioning power and privilege. Just look at the Constitution of this country, where Black people are deemed 3/5 of a human being. I'm sure if you were to trace people's lineage all the way back, and for whoever was a descendant, a direct descendant of the framers of the Constitution, you might say, well, my great-great-great-great-grandpa, he was actually a really good dude. It actually doesn't matter because that really, really, really good dude, if he was one, made rules that actually determined that Black people were less than a whole human being. And the reason for that was to apportion power. And Black people at that time were property. And so saying 3/5 of a human being was really to say, that more power would be given to people who owned more people like me and more people like you. And so if we were to fast forward that to today, I think it's almost weird in some ways to talk about systemic or structural racism. It's kind of like saying, apples are fruit. I mean, race is a system. Gender is a system. It is a series of rules that are based around arbitrary things that have real impacts in everyday people's lives. The question about then how to change that becomes really, really important, because again, if we only talk about people's personalities and people and right and wrong and good and bad people, then we are only going to get the kinds of interpersonal solutions that rely on people's goodwill as opposed to accountability to each other. And so, when people say things like, well, I really support Black Lives Matter, but there's this one thing I don't support, which is that I think all people are equal and everybody, right, should matter. Well, sure, I believe that too. And that's the world that I want to live in. But the fact of the matter is, if I can walk out my front step and step over somebody who's sleeping on my street, then actually all lives are not mattering. And so it's not just a question of our individual values. It's very much a question of the rules that organize our lives and that allow for disparities to not only exist, but to persist. And so that is the kind of core of why we even have movements. Movements erupt and emerge to change the ways that we are organized, to change the ways that the rules organize our lives. Sometimes those movements are in the pursuit of justice, and in other times, those movements are actually in the pursuit of further entrenching that power. That's the moment that we're in right now. We are seeing a real tension between, white nationalism and white supremacy, which has been allowed to flourish again above ground, and this generation's civil rights struggle, which is continuing a struggle that folks have been fighting since Black people landed here and were brought here at the bottoms of boats in chains. And so that is the tension that I think we're dealing with here.
Yeah. I mean, so much of this change, the changes that are happening inside of ad agencies, the changes that are happening in publishing, in tech, in Hollywood, are all about power, right? Are all about who gets to set the terms and about rules. And I so appreciate how clear you are about that. I think that lots of times we end up with these blips of success that only shapeshift back the other way because we're not working to actually change the rules. And we sometimes don't actually end up with success because we don't have a clear analysis of power. I think about we had been spending a good amount of time trying to get credit card companies to stop processing fees for white nationalists. And the credit card companies would tell us to go talk to the banks. And the banks would say, go talk to the credit card companies. And we launched this campaign, and then Charlottesville happened. And we know what happened with the president after Charlottesville. And all of a sudden, as we launched the campaign more publicly, all of these companies that had once said that they couldn't ban white nationalists from being able to process fees suddenly started sending us a list of groups that they had banned. No laws had changed, just the context and the power and the incentives around the decision making. And so much of that has to do with people on the inside and the outside. So I have this next question. It's really related to the role of folks on the inside, folks who are inside of companies right now and sort of what they do and how they engage with movements, how they work with movements. There's this great story that may be more fiction than fact now, but I've heard it a number of times about when Dr. King came back from accepting his Nobel Peace Prize. And the city of Atlanta was putting together a dinner. And none of the business elites had bought tickets. And the CEO of Coca-Cola basically called the business community to task and demanded that people buy tickets. He knew that this could put Atlanta on the map in a new way. It could also put them on a map in a bad way if Dr. King shows back up after winning the Nobel Peace Prize and none of the white leadership shows up to his dinner. They recognized the sort of role that these brands could play by being more connected to what was happening. And those baby steps led to more baby steps over time. And I'm not going to tell a perfect story about corporate relationships to civil rights in any way. And anyone who knows me knows that that's the last thing you'll ever hear from me. But I do think that there is something to say for what does it mean to be on the inside and use your power. And so as a person that has co-created a global brand that is being leveraged and used to drive structural and systemic change, rule change, what do you need from people who are on the inside of these companies? What are the type of ways that you want them signaling? And now we just don't have to rely on the sort of white CEOs of a big company, but we've got Black CEOs and COOs and department heads and diversity leads and all sorts of folks that have power and budgets and authority to move agendas. And as someone on the outside that is working to change the cultural context that makes more of those folks on the inside possible, what are the things that you need? What are the things you hope to get? What are the ways you hope people sort of reach out and offer support?
Great question, Rashad, as per usual. So I'll start here. Again, I think that there is a ton of work that we can continue to do inside these institutions to make them places that are safe for Black people to be. And not just safe interpersonally, right? But that really ensure the dignity and the well-being of Black folks. That's a huge task to undertake, and it's an important one. I think the other piece, though, is that I hear so many companies who are like, we want to be a part of this movement. And I often nod my head and I say the things that I'm about to say right now, and then I wait to see. So let me just offer a couple of things that I think could be really useful. So we're in a context right now where Black Lives Matter went from, and is still a very inspiring series of protests and rebellions and movement for rules change. And I think it's an incredible, incredible moment for institutions and entities to stand publicly with this movement. One of the things I know is that the movement for Black Lives has been, working on what folks are calling a 21st century Civil Rights Act. It's called the Breathe Act, and it's really focused on making sure that we're divesting from a punishment economy and investing in a caring economy, making sure that, when we look at our budgets in cities and states all the way up to Congress, that the majority of our resources aren't being spent on punishment, and that instead our resources are being reinfused into communities that have been left out and left behind for so long. It is important to hear from this sector that you support that work. And it's important, right, to be able to use your voice in the corporate sector, to be able to talk about and amplify these kinds of solutions that movements are putting forward. Rashad, one of the ways that you and I intersect besides being besties is also around the work that we have done together to make sure that that corporations don't just get to say Black Lives Matter and then endanger Black lives. And you all have put out a ton of very, very clear demands to hold companies accountable that actually put Black lives in danger, like mine. It would be important to hear from companies that you stand with this movement in that way, and to say, we are also joining this call for you to be able to protect Black people on platforms. We are also joining this call to ensure that Black people are not being inundated with misinformation and disinformation that is further disenfranchising Black people from being able to make decisions over our own lives in a supposedly free and democratic country. Another example of what people can do right now is that we have a president who is literally waging war on this movement. He has said in the last week that he and his Department of Homeland Security wants to investigate and jail activists who are behind this movement. Hey, y'all. He is literally saying, right, that that actually the biggest threat to this country is not white supremacy, that it's not white militias who showed up in places like Louisville this weekend, heavily armed and in counter protests to Black Lives Matter protesters who are literally trying to get accountability for the police who killed Breonna Taylor in her sleep. This president is saying that the biggest threat to this country is not that kind of movement, but it is instead people who have been lifting their voices and lending their hands to make sure that Black lives matter. It is important for us to hear from companies who also, espouse that Black Lives Matter, that they stand with this movement, that we will not allow this movement to be targeted or attacked, and that we will not allow for this movement to be unsafe in the places that we organize. Those are concrete ways for companies to show up in this moment. And then, of course, we are in the middle of an election season that is one of the most important, if not the most important, of my generation. And to be quite frank. The stakes are high. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. We're in the midst of a crisis in our democracy. We're in and a deep threat to the existence of our democracy. We're in a sharpening climate crisis, and I can tell you, you can see that the room here is dark, but it's 9 o'clock in the morning almost on the West Coast, and the sky is completely black. And so, and we're entering a deepening economic recession. And this is a moment, right, where more than ever, people need to be empowered and protected in making their voice heard. And, we need all hands on deck in that range of things. We need to make sure that people who are heading to the polls in person are able to do so in ways that are safe. And we also need to make sure that we are countering the efforts of this president to dismantle the Postal Service in an effort to rig the election before it even happens. These are all concrete ways that companies can step up right now. And so if you were to ask me, well, what do you need and what can we do for you? Those are the answers that I would offer. Step up for us. Make your voice heard when you hear this president attacking us and calling us terrorist threats. Make sure that you are also lifting your voice in support of making sure that there are free and fair elections, and that people of all walks of life, but particularly people who are deliberately kept from the polls, are able to literally have a red carpet to the voting booth, because that is what it means to actually make Black Lives Matter in this country.
Yeah. And I'll add a little something for you that you didn't say, but I'm also going to say for Black Futures Lab, and I'm going to say for Color of Change. While we don't accept financial support at Color of Change, we do accept content creators creating content that allows us to reach audiences. And for those of you that are inside of places, the movement needs creatives. The movement needs creativity. The movement needs more folks creating the type of visuals and content and creative instruments that allow us to reach, engage, and activate people around the things that we care about. And so if you have the ability to do that, I watched as the LGBT movement and other movements have been powered by folks on the inside from those communities, creating and developing and building content at cost or for free. And so there's all sorts of ways to mobilize your company in those ways as well. And I know that Alicia and myself and others would, Patrisse and Opal and others would absolutely benefit from that. We have to wrap. And the thing I really just want to appreciate, Alicia, is just how much you give of your time and your brilliance, your years of experience. What you all got here was a master class from a master in this work, someone who has built movements, someone who has trained some of the brightest and most courageous young leaders out there, and someone that constantly gives of her time and her energy. And so I just think it's just so incredibly smart and brilliant of ADCOLOR, which is no surprise, to honor you with the Beacon Award. And so I want to congratulate you on receiving the Beacon Award along with my sisters Patrisse and Opal, and also just say thank you, just for one Black person to another. I know what it means for you to put yourself on the line. I know the attacks that you get. I get some of them, a smaller percentage. I know the threats. And I know that you continue each day to wake up and persevere and stand up. And, one thing that we oftentimes say at Color of Change is that when Black people win, everyone wins. The history of this country has been that the victories, the progress, and the social movements that Black people have led have opened up victories for all of us. And in so many ways, Alicia, you continue to open up victories for all of us. So congratulations on your award. Thank you so much, ADCOLOR, for creating the space for this conversation and for us to talk about what does it mean to channel this incredible moment of opportunity and activism into the type of long-term systemic and structural change that our communities deserve and that all of us need. This is our opportunity to make real change. 5, 10, 15 years from now, you'll tell the story about what you were doing in this moment. And you have an opportunity right now to write that story and to write it with action and real change. Thank you all so, so much for having this conversation. And thank you once again, my sister.
Thank you, Rashad. Love you. Love you, ADCOLOR. Thank you.